Hi friends, this is Marilyn from tarotclarity.com again, and I'm sorry that I'm bombarding you with 2 videos today, but I have to strike when the iron is hot and I have available time. Today's video is focusing on the Visconti Sforza Tarot deck. This particular deck was the deck that was published by Il Meneghello, and I did a video on Il Meneghello's historic tarot decks, but I did not include this deck in the video because I didn't own it at the time that I did the video. But suffice it to say, it's made with the same quality that the others were. And this deck came with a book from which much of the information that I'm sharing with you in this video comes from, and what it didn't share, or what, the questions it left me asking, I just looked up in other sources. It's a nice book. The few, photographs are in color. And it's in English, and the English is not so bad. There's been criticism of the Il Meneghello books, but this particular one is okay. I understood it perfectly well. Okay, so a little bit of information about the Visconti Sforza Tarot deck. Obviously, Visconti Sforza is a reference to 2 noble families, the Viscontis and the Sforzas. The alliance between Filippo Maria Visconti and Francesco Sforza was a political alliance facilitated through the marriage of Visconti's daughter Bianca Maria to Francesca Sforza. Visconti betrothed his daughter to Sforza when she was only 5 years old. Sforza was 24 years her senior. So political alliances were more important than a child's, well-being, particularly a daughter's. Political alliances have nothing to do with people liking each other, and these 2 families engaged in power struggles over the years, with Visconti eventually trying to end the alliance that he created, promising his daughter to Sforza, and with Sforza eventually defeating Visconti at his own game. In fact, this particular tarot deck may very well have been commissioned to celebrate Sforza's ascension over his father-in-law's position in power. The wedding of Visconti's daughter Bianca and Francesco Sforza took place when Bianca was 16 years old, and it was believed that the Visconti Madrone Tarot deck, which is another deck I've featured in other videos, may have been commissioned in honor of the wedding. It seemed their marriage was a congenial one, despite Francesco's many infidelities, and even one of his mistresses dying under mysterious circumstances. It was never proven that Bianca arranged the murder of his mistress, but it was a distinct possibility. Those were treacherous days, and in fact, Bianca's and Francesco's eldest son, Galeazzo, may have been responsible for his own mother, Bianca's murder, after Francesco died. Galeazzo is believed killed his mother in a power play. So that's pretty treacherous stuff. And this is the backdrop of, the environment in which these beautiful cards were created. As the cards from this and other Visconti decks were lost or damaged, they were probably commissioned to be painted by different artists. And since this deck was the last of the Visconti Sforza decks, probably the last of the decks of this lineage, these cards were probably used as models for the cards missing from the other Visconti/Sforza decks. Only 4 cards are missing from the original deck. Those 4 cards are the Devil, which seem to be missing from all the Visconti Sforza decks, the Tower, the 3 of Swords, and the Knight of Coins. And those 4 cards have been recreated in this deck so that they may be used for divination. And I'll show you all the cards. I'm just trying to give you a little background information. The pips have a white background with a floral motif. and red borders. The courts and trump cards have a gold background and blue borders. Okay, let's get started. The Fool, or the Madman, Il Matto. In his fist, the Fool holds a stone. It's understood that he's holding a stone in his hand. A medieval audience would have recognized, we're going on the understanding that a medieval audience would have recognized this image and that he was holding a stone. The stone of madness was a thing in medieval society. It was believed that the mad had stones in their brains that caused their madness. Feathers in his head or in his hair would have been recognized as ostrich feathers, since ostriches were thought to be foolish birds who hid their heads in the sand. The image on this card also seems to illustrate Proverb 18:7, which is, a fool's mouth is his ruin. The next card is what we call the Magician, or Il Bagatto. A well-dressed man with a knife, a glass, what appears to be 2 walnuts or coins, and a wedding cake. There he is. This card might have originally represented a server of fine cheese, because this peculiar shape, very odd. What is it, right? And so research done by Christina Dorsini recognized that this is in the style of a type of cheese that is manufactured, or was at least manufactured at the time, of, very specialized cheeses. And so it's a possibility that this is a fine craftsman who, is serving his cheese at a fine banquet by this family, which would explain his fine clothing. You couldn't have a low-class worker appearing in rags, serving food. So he would have been, although he would have been a worker, he would have been a worker, presenting his food, his product to a high-class, environment. In other decks, though, even of his time, he appears to be, and I'm pulling the Budapest, which is more or less roughly around the same period of time. It was a mass-produced woodblock print deck. A fellow who looks like he might have been a street performer, so he might have been a type of street, street charlatan with the cups and the ball and the, catch me if you can kind of thing. And he has an audience. We don't see in the Visconti Sforza deck an audience. And we don't have him in the Estensi. That card doesn't exist. The Magician, Il Bagatto of the Estensi, no longer exists. So depending on how he's presented, in some older Italian decks, he's a cobbler, like a shoe repairman, or a shoemaker. Depending on how this card is depicted will require adjustment in one's understanding of its meaning. Remember, though, that numerologically, this card is valued at 1. So no matter whether he's a person who's serving fine cheese or he's a street charlatan or street performer magician, his rank in society is still the lowest rank. He's still a number 1. So bear that in mind when you see the Magician or Il Bagatto in a tarot deck. Recognize what he's representing. The female Pope. Now this character holds a staff in her right hand, and that's probably a Bible in her left hand. Her robe is in the style of the Franciscan order, so it would have been recognized, she would have been recognized as either a pope, a female pope, or a sister of the Franciscan order. She wears a triple papal crown, papal crown, which solidifies her identification as a person of high morals and wisdom. The knots in her cords, the 3 knots, would represent concepts of obedience, chastity, and poverty. She might have been a reference to St. Joan, who may or may not have actually existed. But the important thing is that a medieval audience believed that she did exist. In any case, there is no evidence that she did exist. But given the scandal, which I'll get to in a second, if she really had existed, the church would have obliterated any and all evidence of her. The myth of St. Joan is that she was a woman who masqueraded as a man because she was particularly intelligent, and she wanted to achieve status within the church, and for the privileges it provided. And she was eventually elected as Pope, with people assuming she was a man. During a public pageant, she very inconveniently went into labor. She had a lover. And the result, the result of a secret love affair. And upon the discovery of her true identity, Joan was killed for her charade and heresy, or whatever crime the church considered it to be. And if you want to learn more about St. Joan, I invite you to watch my video on the number 2 and the papessa, which is part of my numerology playlist. The Empress. The Empress holds a scepter in her right hand and a shield with an imperial eagle in her left, which are symbols of her power. This might be a great time to mention that the scepter of nobility is properly held in the right hand. If you look at paintings of nobility, which of course this is a painting of a noble woman, right? Or even photographs of kings and queens, including, Queen Elizabeth II, in all of them you'll see that the royal scepter is in the right hand. When we see it in the left hand, particularly in woodblock prints, it occurs to me that it's an example, and I say this over and over again in my videos, that it's an example of an image being copied from an original source and then reversed when it's printed. We see the scepter in the left hand in most of the French decks, which come later and were created utilizing the woodblock printing method. Here we have the Emperor. Again, notice how the Emperor is holding his scepter in his right hand, but he's facing in this direction, right? In most decks we're familiar with the Emperor facing in that direction. Now, this is my own observation. This is not something that Dorsini discusses in her book. But it occurs to me that if card makers and other card manufacturers were copying from a source, not that they would have had access to this particular deck, because this deck was owned privately by a family. But if they knew of it, and they copied, the concept of an emperor facing in this direction, when it was printed, it would have been facing in the opposite direction. But at any rate, of course, the Empress was married to the Emperor. Like his wife, the Emperor holds the symbols of his secular power. The globe with the cross he holds in his left hand, and in his right hand, his scepter, which you can barely make out. His white beard suggests age and wisdom. The eagle appears on his hat and not on his shield, as we normally see in other decks, or is typically represented. His eagle represents the symbol of the Roman Empire. The Pope. Again, we see a white beard, the symbol for wisdom and age. In his right hand, he holds a symbol for the blessing or benediction. And it's in his left hand that he holds his scepter or his staff, which differs from the Emperor and the Empress holding their staff in their right hand. It could be that, as the staff is a symbol of worldly power or worldly recognition, which is what the Empress and Emperor would be, secular, they hold secular powers of authority. His is of a spiritual realm. So his benediction with his right hand, or his blessing with his right hand, would have superseded his importance as a secular person. That's not something Dorsini discusses. This is just something that I'm popping in my own 2 cents and my own observation of having looked at tarot decks for the past 50 years. Let's see what else. His garment appears to have the Visconti symbol or emblem of the radiant sun pattern. And for the Visconti family, so I'll remember that although Sforza and Visconti were political rivals, Sforza's wife Blanca was still a Visconti, and that name still meant something. It still was a name that meant power. Love. The usual symbolism with Cupid and his bow and arrow and a pair of lovers is here. And with this particular deck, we have the appearance of a column. Cupid is standing on a column. Now, maybe other decks didn't notice the column because it fades in, because it matches the background. Or maybe other decks just created, Cupid flying through the air because he is a winged character. Who knows? Notice that the hands cross the pillar so that the pillar and the hands kind of form a cross, which further reminds us that this union is a union which must not be broken. The idea of longevity is furthermore, stressed in the visual clues by the man's garment, which has an octagonal pattern to it. 8 is the number of infinity, representing eternity. And then also the column or the pillar itself might also be a symbol for stability, longevity. This is a very interesting card, the Chariot. She's in profile, and it is a she. Once again, we see the same pattern in the garment of the charioteer as we saw in the Pope, the radiant sun, which is an emblem for the Visconti family. This charioteer is a woman holding her scepter in her right hand, and in her left the globe and cross. The cart is drawn by 2 horses with golden wings. The woman in this card is probably Bianca Maria Visconti herself, and she is identified by her dress garment of Francesco Sforza's wife. It's a card of glory and victory. It is historically known that Bianca aided her husband in battle, saving his life. And this card is probably a nod to that event, which brings us to the next card, which also makes a reference to the same event. Justice card. Now, justice. Again, notice the heraldic symbol for the Visconti clan in the garment. Let's see if I get a good angle on it. In her right hand, Justice holds the sword of justice, and in her left, the scales. In this particular justice card, a knight appears who appears to be a woman and has been identified as Bianca Maria Visconti. When Bianca was made aware that her husband's safety had been compromised, she put on her armor and galloped by horseback to participate in battle, even killing a man. She was celebrated as a warrior, so her appearance as a knight on the card of justice validates or solidifies the belief that she fought on the side of righteousness. Look at the colors, look at the sky. And although I'm giving, a history or a explanation of these cards, truly, I hope you're admiring and enjoying the colors and the richness of this deck. Okay, here we are with the Hermit. Well, once again, we see a long white beard, the beard that shows or expresses age and wisdom. In his right hand, he holds an instrument of time. the hourglass. A sundial would have been used by day and an hourglass by night. Is the hermit traveling by night? In later decks, the hourglass sort of morphed into a lantern, which suggests nighttime activity. It also suggests nighttime activity, right? Because a lantern, you don't need it in the day. In his left hand, this hermit holds a stick. Maybe a walking stick, but it also could have been doing double duty by day, serving as a sundial stick, since by day it would have cast a shadow. This type of stick used as a sundial was known as a gnomon and was used as one of the very earliest sundials. The first mechanical clocks were not invented until about 12 and 1300s. So the hermit is a reminder of both day and night and the passage of time. The number 9 is half the number of 18, which is the moon, which is generally appears at night, right? So let's take a look at the Estensi Tarot, which, more or less was from the same period of time. Once again, we have an hourglass. He's going in the other direction. So a poetic license or artistic license for either artist to have the character walking in the opposite direction. And let's take a look at the Budapest hermit. Now this is really ambiguous. It could be an hourglass, right? It could be that this line represents the sand and this little triangular shape represents the sand. And maybe there's some confusion about this. And maybe others who have, seen this card and misunderstood it as a lantern. This might have been kind of like an ambiguous thing in his hand because maybe the artist didn't know if it was a lantern or an hourglass. And I apologize if I called this thing a sundial. If I didn't call it an hourglass, I apologize. So you can see how, based on memory, maybe somebody played a card game, in Italy using this deck and then went to France and said, oh, I know this card game. It's really great. And there's this cast of characters and this guy carries a lantern because maybe he misunderstood that this might have been an hourglass. You see how that happens? I'm not saying it did, but it just seems to me that it might have. Here we are, presented now with the Wheel of Fortune. Fortuna is represented in the center, blindfolded, and bears the emblems of the Visconti family of the radiant sun in her garment. At the top of the wheel, there is a king with his staff in his right hand, and although he currently reigns, he has the ears of a jackass or a donkey or something like that, perhaps representing man's ignorance or pride. Maybe it's a reference to whoever happened to have currently held the power at that time, and someone maybe who Sforza wanted to topple could have represented his father-in-law, since this is the Visconti outfit, right? The Visconti clothing style. The faces are rendered in detail, so maybe it's possible that each of these individuals were meant to identify specific people, or maybe it was serving as the traditional message of Lady Fortuna, that being at the top is a temporary condition. Power and youth are temporary conditions after all. The figures around the wheel demonstrate one who currently reigns, right? One who has reigned, one who will reign, and one who is without reign, who has never reigned or is without reign currently. Notice that the man without reign at the bottom of the wheel is the only one who appears with a beard, a white beard, right? Which, as we've established, is the symbol of age and wisdom. Maybe he represents a man who has never sought the temporary glow of the spotlight, or maybe he is wise because he did once reign and in his fall has been enlightened. Following the 9th card, which was the Hermit, the wheel can also be a symbol to remind us the continuing the passage of time and is reminiscent of the sun's radial movement. So it might be serving a dual purpose. The next card is the Strength card. And notice that none of these cards have numbers on them. Because, the order of the cards may have varied according to the region where they were played. And even maybe from game to game, maybe the families, would establish, like we establish with rules that we modify a game, like in Monopoly, like land on go and you collect the money, even though that's not really a real, a real rule. It may have been that the family would establish their priorities in the sequencing of numbers. And for that reason, maybe they just weren't, they weren't numbered. But at any rate, Strength appears as a young man in the act of beating or taming a lion, breaking its spirit, brute force, taming something that's wild that would normally be more powerful than ourselves. Seems to be a reference to Hercules and the lion, with Hercules demonstrating courage and physical strength, overcoming human limitations. And so we do see references in these trump cards, references to mythological stories or ancient stories for sure. The Hanged Man. Now, the punishment for traitors was this particular style of hanging, but you'll notice that the man is alive and unconcerned, right? So why is that? And I've read this from multiple sources. This is just, I'm not sure if Dorsini mentioned it in her book, but I've read it elsewhere. That it's because these types of images really served as a type of medieval mugshot, put up on the walls like, mugshots are, or, man wanted kind of signs in a sheriff's office today. And they were intended to disgrace the individual before they, came to be punished. And, they were typically painted on walls and were temporary and replaced by the image of the next criminal after this particular guy had been punished, They were shame paintings. So the reason they're alive is that because they weren't dead. They were like mugshots. You had to be able to identify this guy. That was the whole point of it. You had to know who this individual was, because how else would they be disgraced if you didn't know? So that is the reason why they were alive, alive looking and not dead. The next card is Death. Now, in this particular card, Death holds a bow and an arrow. The arrow is a little harder to make out because of the lack of contrast. This is an original detail that we don't typically see in the Death card. This particular iconography is present in the Triumph of Death, which was a medieval Italian fresco, which I went off on a tangent and researched, that reminds the viewer that death comes for all of us, almost like a hunter. In the fresco that I mentioned, the three themes of death, so prevalent to the times, were the plague, hunger, and war. But this death only holds one arrow, which seems to have, might likely have been reserved for the plague, which would have been the most concerning of the three plagues, the three themes that would have been a threat to medieval society at that particular time. The next card is Temperance. She's one of the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, and fortitude being the other three. Temperance moderates the impulses of mankind, and everything, to everything there is a purpose, right? But some things are better left in moderation. Notice the cliff. Okay, now, the devil doesn't exist in the original deck of cards. in any of the Visconti Sforza collections. So I'm going to skip this. This is clearly a representation. And it doesn't exist, or we don't have any copy of it in the Estensi deck either. But it did exist in the Rosenwald. Let me pause and pull the Rosenwald Devil.